Julie.
How are you, Val?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very good. Welcome to my home.
This is the official Rebel Man home. This is Julie Mann, momager of Rebel Man. I birthed a band.
I birthed a band, literally.
Let's talk about your band. Let's talk about Jonathan and Bryce, the twins, the band.
Wow, Jonathan and Bryce are very special, and I hope I do this with composure. Jonathan and Bryce are my twins, and they're now 16. And Jonathan and Bryce were born almost 8 weeks too early, University of Chicago. And I went into labor very early with them. And while at University of Chicago, they were declared physically deceased. So me being a determined woman, it was March 26, 1997, and something inside me did not like that number 6. And I refused to believe that my babies were dead. And we had no movement, we had no tone, we had no heartbeat, we had no chest rise of either child. So I held out. I prayed for my own death for the 3 of us. My daughter was 3, Jillian. So I knew she'd be fine with her father. And when death didn't come, I finally agreed after 8 hours that we would go to the OR on March 27th. And at the University of Chicago, I don't remember the exact number, but there's many people involved in the birthing of multiples, from doctors to fellows to nurses. And at least 8 to 10 African American women, nursing staff at the University of Chicago, came in my labor room, and they pushed my hospital bed away from the wall. And they turned the lights out, and they encircled my gurney and held hands. And they prayed for life. And we went to the OR.
Wow.
And I was put under, and they pulled 2 barely alive babies from me. And of course I didn't see them. And my husband got to see them for basically a minute. And then, everything went dark for both of us for several hours. He didn't know what was going on. I, of course, was under anesthesia. And early in the next morning, I got to see them, and Jonathan was critical, very critical, at 3 pounds, 2 pounds 14 ounces. And Bryce was doing better. He was having problems breathing and eating, but he was 4 pounds, so he looked like a giant. Jonathan had no skull. His fingers were the size of fork prongs, literally. His legs were the size of my ring finger. And all I remember about Jonathan were his hands. I remember his hands. And he had, he had the hat on, and he had the glasses on for the jaundice. His eyes were covered. And he had IVs in his heads, and he had IVs in his ankles, and he had IVs in his hands. And he had a gavage tube down his throat, nose. But I remember the cry. It's almost not human sounding because they're so small. It's like a very small animal. And he has no skull. He basically looks like a rat, a wet rat, seriously. And he was whimpering. And when they wheeled me to him, because I'd been on my back for weeks and weeks, I'd not been on a bed. And he stopped crying when I heard my voice. But I remember Bryce was clasped like an infant, and Jonathan rolled his hands. And it's almost like he was fascinated with his own fingers. And he would put his hands to his face and the sides of his cheek. And he would actually, not even 3 pounds, he would wrap them around that tube in his nose. And he wanted it out. And he was able to pull it out. And, they thought he had an intestinal rot. They gave him less than 72 hours to live. And he made it through. But the striking thing about Jonathan in his weeks in the NIC unit and after were, to me, I didn't know his fingers were special. And, to me, I'm his mother. He's an amazing guitar player. but his hands were never fisted. He always rolled them, and from the day he was born. So I knew there was something special with his fingers. I just didn't know what. And then he was able to pull that tube out, and they were both able to pull that tube out. And he was a failure to thrive. He did not gain weight. He was stable, but he wasn't improving. And that's when we decided to put him back in an incubator with Bryce, his twin. And when we put them back together, he began to gain weight, and he began to physically improve. And he improved enough to hit 4 pounds, and the university medical staff realized my husband and I were intelligent enough to care for 2 preemie babies. And then typically a baby comes home at 4.5, 5 pounds, and they released him early so that he could come home and be back with his brother, where we, because one was released, Bryce was released a month earlier than John, or not quite a month, a few weeks, so we could put them back together, and they're still quite bonded. They're very close. But I knew that after going through all that I knew God had a plan. I just didn't know what the plan was. Definitely not rock and roll.
Interesting that you used the word intelligent. You said that they could see that you and your husband were intelligent enough. You didn't use the word nurturing, loving, or caring.
You're right.
But intelligent enough to be able to care for this preemie baby. And I thought that was very interesting, because fast forward now to seeing you and the twins along with Clayton and the band, the way that you manage it. You and your husband are a very intelligent team. We all love our kids. We all nurture our teams, our children, our teams, our children.
Right.
But let's talk about that extra intellect that's necessary to get through the hardships, not only to get through it, but to triumph and do what you're doing now. Just that extra mind.
I think when you have a critically ill child, and they both were critically ill, and there's something maternal in you that's nurturing, but you have to step back and breathe, and you have to pay attention with what's going on. You cannot, at least in me, and I've known this in other parents, you cannot be emotional when your child is critically ill.
Right.
Because you have to be able to understand what's going on. You have to make intelligent decisions. You have to sometimes make them very quickly, and you have to be able to think and respond. So, for us, having 2 babies, even though Bryce wasn't as critical, we still had problems with his heart rate. He could not breathe, suck, and swallow at the same time. So, deductive reasoning and the intelligence of being able to grasp the situation was important. Of course, we were loving, we were nurturing, and you have that mom instinct, but I had to pay attention. I had to understand the monitors and what I was looking for, and, temperature rise, temperature drop, all these different medical aspects of care that they needed to ensure a healthy life. And I was blessed that being born almost 8 weeks too early, that they basically were not in any kind of mental or physical capacity compromised at all, which very well could have been.
Right.
Do I see things today? Absolutely. They say it takes a preemie 26 years to catch up.
Wow.
26 years. And I do see that in them, and there's no developmental delay or anything, but, I have 2 other children. I have Jillian, who's now 20, and Clayton. And, there's always been more health issues with Jonathan and Bryce, but by the grace of God, they're healthy, they're thriving, and music is a big part of who they are. But I have an engineering degree from U of I, University of Illinois. My husband's also a graduate of the University of Illinois, and I think a higher education is extremely important. I think my education as an engineer, the attention to detail, the deductive reasoning, I don't like the word no. I don't like the word I don't know how. There's always let me figure that out.
Right.
Let me see what I can do. Because as an engineer, when you're designing or constructing something, no doesn't exist.
Right.
You can't say, if that doesn't work, you have to find a solution. So I think that's helped carry over in building the business Rebel Man. The band's now incorporated, and I'm to the point of, I feel like I'm at another transitional point with the band on what now do I need to learn or do or not do in order to get to that next level.
Wow. And I love the way that you say, I birthed a band, not I birthed these children and they turned into a band. I birthed a band.
Yeah.
As a mother, how do you birth a band?
Well, that's kind of my personal motto. It was something kind of, I like to think I have a sense of humor and a quick wit, so that's my Twitter profile, I birthed a band. I don't know if this was key, but music was always a big part of my life and my husband's life, more so his side more on the gospel side. And my family's also Christian, but I grew up in a rock and roll house. I grew up with, there was always Creedence playing, or Bobby Vinton, Tom Jones, Elvis Presley. I saw these people in concert at a young age. And very early on, my father taught me to listen to the backbeat of music. And that was a very difficult concept for me to grasp at 4 years old. And he would dance around in the living room with me to Creedence, and I, to listen to the backbeat, not to the chorus and the melody, but the backbeat. So when I was pregnant, I always listened to music, and I listened to it very loudly. So to the point where I thought, wow, at least they're swimming. I knew they were healthy. But the other thing I did, and I don't know, I really don't know if it's a musical influence, but because they were preemies, under all my children's beds, I had a tape recorder, and I played Mozart and classical music very quietly under their cribs and under their beds, probably for 3 or 4 years, as a soothing mechanism. So from the time Jonathan and Bryce came home, even Clayton, classical music was always played for them. So I don't know if that had an impact on their development, mentally, emotionally, the neurons connecting in the brain.
I think that it may have had an impact on not just the music, but just their intellect, period. And when you talk about all of the different kinds of music, classical, gospel, blues, and rock, it sounds like all of that is incorporated into their music a little bit. I know that Clayton plays classical music, and you can kind of hear all of it, and that gives them a unique flavor, because I listen to all kinds of music as well. And I told you this before, Rebel Man has a draw which is almost spiritual. They connect with you on a spiritual level, and it's not really, it kind of transcends the music. It hits a higher level.
I know that right now they've written 10 songs, and their ability to write their own music fascinates my husband and I, because they're in school full time, and if they had more time, I know that they would have many more songs written than the 10 they have. But I can say their music tells a story.